To wrap up the first half of American history, we're going to talk about the Civil War here. Now, there are a lot of great videos online you can watch about the Civil War, a lot of great documentaries that have been made. I'm just here going to give y'all a simple, easy to understand, basic overall narrative of the war. So let's start here after Southern secession, which we talked about in the last lecture. So after Southern secession, President Lincoln assumed the presidency, and he declared war on the Confederacy. He declared the states to be in rebellion and said that they did not have a right to secede from the Union. Robert E. Lee was made the commander of the Confederate Army. He was courted by the Union, and the Union was hoping that he would take command of the Union Army. However, when his home state of Virginia seceded, he decided to go with commanding the Confederacy. Now, he himself was not a supporter of slavery, but he was very loyal to the state of Virginia, and therefore he commanded for the Confederacy. The Union was not so lucky with finding a skilled general so early on. Instead, they went through about a dozen generals in the first 2 years of the Civil War, until finally, in the middle of the war, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant to be the general, and he remained throughout the final 2 years, the second half of the Civil War. Now, both Lee and Grant were brilliant. They were very much tactical geniuses. Grant, in particular, was determined to wear down the enemy, no matter how many Union soldiers had to die in the process. As far as the advantages and disadvantages of both sides at the beginning of the war, the North had a much larger population. It was about twice the size of the South, so they had that going for it. It also had about twice the wealth. It was much richer, and it was more industrialized. They had twice as much railroad track than the South. But the South did have better military generals from the beginning, and they were fighting mostly in their own territory. About 95% of the war took place in the South. Only a couple of very important battles, Antietam and Gettysburg. Those were the main conflicts that took place in the North. Almost everything else took place in the South. Now, if you talk about the battles of the Civil War, it's really divided into two different theaters, and we can draw the line right about here. And the Eastern Theater is everything to the east of that line. The Western Theater is everything to the west of it. So the Eastern Theater is the fighting that happened in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, mostly. The vast majority of this fighting did take place in Virginia. And then the Western Theater is the fighting that took place in Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, that region, really, west of the Appalachians, we could say. So here are a few of the major battles, what they meant to the war, the overall legacy of each of these major engagements. So the first was called the Battle of Fort Sumter. This was in April 1861, and this was not a major battle. In fact, there really weren't any major battles in 1861, except for maybe the Battle of Bull Run. But this was the first. This was where the first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The South was victorious here. They won this very minor battle. No person died. The only death was one horse. But the fact that the South won, this caused Southerners to be very positive about their chances in this war. Many of them saw this as their second war for independence, first one being against the British, second one being against the North, and they thought this would be a very fast war. Now, the North also thought that this would be a very fast war since they had so many of the advantages. The first battle of Bull Run was really the first big battle of the Civil War. This was in July of 1861. The South won this battle as well, and this was in Manassas, Virginia, where the Union Army went south of the Potomac and invaded Virginia in the attempts to get the Confederacy to surrender and rejoin the Union. Most famously at this battle of Bull Run, the General Thomas Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall because his men said they stood firm like a stone wall against the enemy. And it was at this point, really, that the North realized that this war was not going to be won easily. After the ensuing winter, in the spring, the war started back up again. Fighting started back up again, I should say. And the Battle of Shiloh took place in western Tennessee. This was the first major battle in the Western Theater. It was also the first major Union victory. And over 20,000 people were killed or wounded in this battle. You can visit this battle site. It's about an hour east of Memphis. It's close to the city of Corinth in Mississippi. But yeah, over 20,000 casualties, extremely costly battle for both sides. And this was General Grant's first big victory. Then you have the Battle of Antietam. This was the bloodiest day in U.S. history. More Americans died on this day than on any day in our history. This was September 17th, 1862. And this was a one-day battle. Many of the battles took place over multiple days, maybe even up to a week. But this was just in one day, in a few hours, really. Over 22,000 people were killed or wounded. This was also a Union victory. Now, the Southern troops had just invaded the North, and they were stopped at Sharpsburg, Maryland, close to Antietam Creek, and they were pushed back into Virginia. The Battle of Fredericksburg happened several months later in December of 1862, and this was a Confederate victory in Virginia. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is something that President Lincoln decided to issue on January 1st, 1863. So the war has been going on for a little less than 2 years at this point, and he makes a decision after Antietam that preserving the Union is not enough. In addition to preserving the Union, he's going to use this opportunity to also free the slaves, to abolish slavery. And the second reason he wanted to do this, aside from the fact that it was the right thing to do, was the fact that he wanted to keep other nations out of this war. At the beginning, that was a big question. Was England going to join this war? Was France going to join this war? And they were even considering joining on the side of the Confederacy. Because remember, the United States, which at this point was the Union, the North, had gone against Britain in the American Revolution and the War of 1812. So some British people wanted to join the Confederacy, especially because the Confederacy had such a good trading relationship with Britain, gave them a lot of their cotton. But when Lincoln blockaded the southern coastline of the South, wouldn't let any cotton be traded, that really crippled the Confederates' economy, and it made Britain have to look elsewhere, like Egypt, for their cotton. But anyway, the Emancipation Proclamation was something that was intended to send a message to other nations, especially those in Europe that had abolished slavery years before at this point. And the message he was trying to make was that this war is about slavery. He said, don't let people fool you. Slavery is the biggest issue in this war. The South isn't just fighting for a way of life that's some vague concept, but it's slavery was the core of that way of life. So the document signed by President Lincoln proclaimed that the slaves in the Confederacy were now free. Groundbreaking work of legislation here, an executive order, really. However, the Confederacy rejected this order because they said, hey, Lincoln's not my president. We're not under his control. We're under the control of Jefferson Davis, they said. But even though this order did not free all the slaves immediately, it still proclaimed to the rest of the world that the Civil War was at least mostly about slavery. And so this kept European countries like Britain from getting involved and supporting the Confederacy. And so this is what gave the Union the best shot to win. After the Emancipation Proclamation, hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks, about 25% of the slave population, walked away from slavery, were able to escape, and tried to seek protection from the approaching Union armies. Almost 200,000 African Americans, most of whom were newly freed slaves, ended up serving in the Union Army and the Union Navy, mostly in the second half of the war, the second 2 years. They were segregated into all-black units, the most famous of which was the 54th Massachusetts Unit. And this was the first black division. These were the first black soldiers to see action in the Civil War. They fought at the Battle of in Tennessee, the Battle of it escapes my mind. It'll come to me in a second. But it was the battle on the fort that the Confederates were defending from the Union. All right, so over 37,000 African Americans died in the Civil War. Many of them fought The Battle of Chancellorsville. This was a Confederate victory in Virginia, and this was a big turning point in the war because Lee's best general, Stonewall Jackson, was killed. Now, even though it was a Confederate victory, the Confederates took this as a loss because Lee's best general, Stonewall Jackson, was now killed. He said that he had lost his right arm here. And Lee was then, he was very desperate at that point. And he said that now that Jackson was killed, the Confederacy needs to attack the North now to try to end the war quickly before more reinforcements from the North can arrive. So he decided then that additional troops he could not afford to send out west to the Western Theater, to Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was currently under Union siege and badly needed backup. Lee decided he needed to keep all the troops he could with him in the Eastern Theater. He also decided to invade the North in an attempt to end this war swiftly, since he no longer had his best general. So really, Chancellorsville was a big turning point in the war. Fort Wagner, by the way, it was Fort Wagner in South Carolina that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment tried to invade, but failed to capture from the Confederacy. So after the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, the turning points of the war began to occur, and they were simultaneously carried out in Gettysburg and Vicksburg. So the Battle of Vicksburg took place on the Mississippi River in western Mississippi. City of Vicksburg was besieged by the Union. To put a siege around a city means to surround it, not let anybody in or out. And the people of Vicksburg started to starve. They ate all the food there. They ate everything they could find. Then they started to eat their pets. Then they ate rats. I mean, this siege lasted a very long time, and it was detrimental to Vicksburg. That's why if you visit Vicksburg today, there aren't many antebellum homes or big mansions from before the Civil War, but there are a bunch in Natchez because Natchez surrendered very quickly to the Union, but Vicksburg held out for a very long time. So this siege of Vicksburg was led by Grant, and once the battle ensued, once the people of Vicksburg were weakened, the Union invaded and took the city of Vicksburg. And with this victory, the Union gained total control of the Mississippi River and cut the Confederacy in half. So you have Grant's two biggest victories being at Shiloh in April of 1862 and in Vicksburg in July of 1863. In fact, a big reason why the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum is in Starkville on the fourth floor of the library at Mississippi State is because Starkville is about halfway between Shiloh and Vicksburg, which were the sites of his two biggest victories. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg happened at the same time as the Battle of Vicksburg, the first 3 or 4 days of July of 1863. This took place in Pennsylvania. The army of Robert E. Lee invaded the North to try to get them to stop fighting. And this was the bloodiest battle in the war. So while Antietam was the bloodiest day, this battle that lasted 3 days had the most casualties of any battle in the war. And in fact, this is the bloodiest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The North won, and the South was permanently pushed back. And it was at this point that it became clear that it was only a matter of time before the Union was going to win the war. The only question is, how many more people would have to die? How much longer would the South keep fighting? The tide had decisively turned, both in the Eastern Theater with Gettysburg and in the Western Theater with Vicksburg. A couple of the other major battles in the last 2 years of the war were the Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia, where it was a very chaotic battle in the middle of the woods. Neither side won decisively, and yet about 28,000 people were killed or wounded. Then you have Sherman's March to the Sea, in which Union General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta, burned Atlanta, and then marched from Atlanta to Savannah, burned and destroyed everything in his path, from farms to homes to railroad tracks, pulling them up and tying them around trees so that Confederate trains couldn't run. He and his army were able to basically scorch Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, and then turn northward to the Carolinas in order to meet Lee's troops in Virginia. So this was very cruel, but it was also very effective. This is known as total war, when you involve the civilian population, which is heartless, but at the same time it's effective, because the civilian population is what really keeps the soldiers going. Now, in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Now, when a war ends, you have to sign a treaty, and in that treaty it says terms of agreement, or terms of surrender. So I'll surrender under these terms. And Lincoln insisted that the terms for the end of the war, the terms, the condition to end fighting, had to include two things. Number one, the readmission of the southern states back into the Union, and number two, the abolition of slavery in all the states. And those two things were not guaranteed at this point, but Lincoln said this must happen. Slavery has to be gone. We can't have another war to fight this. We need to take the opportunity now and say, you have to rejoin the Union, and you can no longer have slaves. Lee didn't like slavery anyway, so he agreed to these terms. And this is why the U.S. was preserved and why slavery was abolished. And the war was really the first event in U.S. history that was thoroughly documented by photographs, and that really ensured its impact for future generations. Something that happened during the war that didn't get a lot of press at the time because the war was going on, but was still very important, was the Homestead Act of 1862. So this is something that encouraged Americans to move into the territory out west that America had recently acquired. While most of the fighting in the Civil War did not happen out west, one of the reasons why the war happened was the West, because the question was, is slavery going to extend to the West or not? And that's something that really brought the North and the South at loggerheads. But in order to populate the West and bring that prosperity to the rest of the country, the U.S. government gave all settlers 160 acres of land for free, a homestead on which to start a farm. And this was incentive for people to move west and take a risk on starting a farm. Now, slavery was officially abolished in the entire United States by the 13th Amendment, and this Lincoln and the congressional Republicans were able to get passed in January of 1865. So this is still a few months before the war has stopped, but this is what officially abolishes slavery in the entire U.S., meaning in the border states, everywhere, not just the Confederacy, like the Emancipation Proclamation did. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And this is a huge amendment, because the 13th Amendment, after it was passed, meant that this system that had been such a huge part of the American economy and way of life for decades and decades was now over forever. Now, without modern communications technology, it took until June 19th, 1865, for the last slaves all the way out in Texas to be informed of their freedom and released. And this was in Galveston by a Union general. And that's why we celebrate Juneteenth every June 19th as the day when independence was completely delivered to all people in America. 4 million slaves became freed men and freed women as a result of the Civil War. And for these people and their descendants, economic hardship and political oppression would continue for another century. But even so, the end of slavery represented a momentous step, because suddenly slaves born with no rights at all were protected by the Constitution, with endless possibilities of freedom. So to wrap up here, more Americans died in the Civil War than in every other war the U.S. has fought in combined. So if you combine all of the American deaths from the World Wars, the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Barbary Wars, Mexican War, Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghanistan, Iraq, all of them combined is less than the number of Americans who died in the Civil War. So many people were killed in this war, over 600,000 Americans. But it did accomplish a lot. In addition to the abolition of slavery, it permanently unified our country. And this is shown most in the fact that we are still one nation today. If the South had succeeded in breaking apart and becoming its own country, it's very possible we would be not just two countries today, but maybe as many as 7 different countries today, because that precedent would have been set of breaking apart from the country every time you don't like something. And this is shown most clearly because people stopped saying the United States as a plural noun and started to use it as a singular noun. For example, people used to say the United States are something, like the United States are beautiful. But nowadays we say the United States is beautiful. Okay? So we see our country as one unified entity instead of a collection of 50 different entities. And really, it was the Civil War that was the biggest watershed moment in American history, and it created the nation that the United States is today.